The events which I will narrate now happened simultaneously to Jorg's invasion of the New World. The Mad King of Ven had become increasingly distressed, for not only had each and every attempt at improving his kingdom been a vain effort, but he had also now begun to lose a huge chunk of his territory in an invasion by foreign warriors he didn't foresee coming, and he heard the news of Hugo's alliance with Alken, and of Alken's rising military. It was under these circumstances that he grew suspicious of his queen, entertaining the idea that she had been trading secrets with Ven's enemies. Their relation had been cold and distant since its beginning, and the queen would often hide away as the belfry, prohibiting anyone from entering it. When he heard of the Lindelt-Alken alliance, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Thus, he had plans to invade the belfry the next time she went there. The king and his royal guard would slaughter the bellkeeper puppets, leaving behind piles of bodies. They climbed the tower and found the queen meeting with the spirit of the king of Alken atop it. In a fit of madness and uncontrollable rage, the king of Ven stabbed his queen in front of both his subordinates and her secret lover. Instants after the frenzy, the killer deeply regretted his actions, and was finally able to perceive his own insanity. He'd sentence himself to perpetual imprisonment at the Bastille's most secluded cell, and leave his kingdom devoid of a king and a queen. The castle he ruled over would become known as the Lost Bastille, and the king as the Lost Sinner. As a prisoner, he wore a black mask made from guy steel, the special alloy of Forossa, whose secret formula he had shared with his allied nations. The mask was molded to portray the king's descent into darkness, and it bore spikes pointed toward its owner's face, which would serve to blind and torture him, a self-inflicted, symbolic punishment for his lack of foresight, which he perceives to have been the source of his empire's downfall, the guy steel being emblematic of his hollowing, for the alloy lacks souls within its constitution, which is what grants it its unique properties. His sword, which was forged from guy steel, would have its essence twisted by his guilt, for it would drain its wielder's health with each swing, and have its strength penalized by its wielder's sins. Even hollowed and cuffed, however, his origin as a warrior king of Forossa is betrayed by his nimble movements and swordplay. The penalized king, who was once the bravest of lion knights, who strived so fiercely for the sun, now could not bear to see the faintest light. The darkness of his cell was a symbol of his foolishness, though the bearer of the curse can circumvent it by lighting 2 fires to brighten it. Interestingly, the Japanese text never specifies the gender of the lost sinner, for the title refers to both the Mad King and to the Witch of Chaos who possessed him, one of the many clever details of the game's writing. In comparison, the English text refers to the lost sinner as a she, for it is referring to the witch. The spirits of the bellkeepers would eternally haunt the belfries, despite their abandonment. They would follow their duty even after death. As a result of witnessing the tragic death of his lover before his eyes, the king of Alken would be left profoundly scarred. The wound in his heart would never heal, only grow deeper and deeper. Despite now having nearly the entire continent under his banner, as his empire finally reached its heyday, his achievements weren't enough to satisfy him. He would fall into depravity and hedonism, abandoning his ambition to become a true king. He wouldn't aim to link the fire, but to create an immortal, earthly paradise, or rather, an Icarus hell, which he would rule as a mighty emperor. The crest his empire had inherited from the king and queen of Heide, the 2 dragons and the sword piercing the flower, became devoid of its meaning. The vulgar materialism of the Iron King was epitomized by his newfound hobby of collecting weapons to keep as prizes and decoration. The king descended from an ancient culture of honorable warriors that traced its roots from before the Age of Fire, a culture that respected bravery and valor above all. But the king had subverted it by treating weapons as toys, and reveling in acts of dishonor and cruelty. The king would extensively reform his castle, turning it into an abomination of iron. He'd ordered the construction of iron statues that depicted his newfound ambition, a flower that hosted a flame, which is symbolic of the sun, that is erected by a group of men, in reference to how the undead must carry the burden of erecting the sun, by having their souls emptied by the dark sign. There are also various cherub-like statues holding fires atop their heads throughout the keep. The statue of Velka, which was situated at the center of the bridge to his castle, was symbolically chained, and the chains that were attached to it host cages. And as I've explained, such cages served to imprison men to extract their souls to fuel the sun. He'd also capture and enslave the flame salamanders to serve his castle's defenses. The satanic cruelty of the Iron King was betrayed by the new faith he would spread to his people, the worship of Nar Alma, the god of blood. Nar Alma was a horrific false idol, whose character goes completely against what the figure it was deliberately made to subvert stood for. That being Velka, the mother of the forlorn, who shed tears to mourn the undead, and who became a martyr for the sake of the many, of the meek. She was the goddess who served as a pillar to Alken since its foundation, and who watched over the entrance to the king's castle, the goddess of firelinking. Nar Alma, a deity who desires only bloodshed, who judges his followers based on the number of men they kill, as indicated by the Libra it holds, its meaning being the inversion of Velka's Libra, which signifies divine justice upon sinners, and who is depicted with a stoic expression on his face, was the absolute inversion of Kaita, the goddess of tears, who is Velka's interpretation by the civilizations of the New World. Velka's scythe symbolizes the power the meek hold over the powerful, for scythes are weapons that derive from farming tools of peasants. And so, should the rulers abuse their power, they'd face justice manifested as death, which is universal. The scythe too had its meaning subverted, and Nar Alma wielded it as a symbol of senseless death and violence. Even his gender is inverted. Velka was a female, and Nar Alma is a male god. Velka was the goddess of sin, for she punished the guilty. Nar Alma, the god of the sinners, for he emboldened the guilty. Kremel is a false deity worshipped alongside Nar Alma. The god of struggle is based on Kirk, the Knight of Thorns, who dedicated himself to serving a saint. He'd invade out of necessity, to pillage humanity which he'd gives to his sickly savior, so that she could survive, a sinner with pure intentions, a martyr. Kremel, however, is a deity worshipped by senseless sinners, who view him as a god that encourages the proliferation of suffering. The Ring of Thorns is an aggressive tool, one that does not protect its owner, but damages his aggressor, used by the warriors of Hugo, who rush mindlessly into combat. Tichigran, the original Bellkeeper, would be appointed as the leader of Nar Alma's covenant by the Iron King. Its adherents, most of them hailing from Hugo, would be instructed to hunt undead mercilessly. In accordance with their cowardly but aggressive ways, they'd wield shield crossbows to inflict agony upon others with impunity, as well as whips and other weapons that doubled as instruments of torture. The puppet created to protect the forbidden love was turned into a satanic pastor of a death cult as that love was killed. The blood cultists, led by 3 warrior pyromancers of Hugo, whose armor resembles that of Auros, would invade the sunless realm of Mira, its last remaining territory, and decimate its people. The hunters had become the hunted. The warriors of Mira, who hunted undead, were now the undead being hunted by Hugo's crusade, a symbolic, ironic punishment for their twisted ways. The spring which was the source of the holy water of Mira would be tainted by piles and piles of bodies as a result of that war. However, the men of the land would rise again, for they were undead, and so, the hunts would be prolonged unto eternity, and eventually, the hunters themselves, who were covered in wounds, scars, and some of whom became cannibals and bloated like pigs in a subtle reference to Smaug, who served Gwyn, like they served the Iron King, would hollow. The moonlit butterflies that inhabited the realm would become poisonous, for the tree sap they fed upon had been contaminated by the blood of undead, which is toxic. After the Iron King's men had conquered the land, they'd build a colosseum to torture undead to the point where their souls faded into nothing, yet another subversion of the ancient culture of Gwyn's clan of warriors. A skeletal, miasma-spewing, spike-bearing chariot would continually gallop through the arena to trample over and cut through the waves of undead. Necromancers would then continually revive those that had been killed, so they'd be killed more, and each time, their souls would wane a little more. And in a tie to the idea of souls exchanging energy with each other, resulting in a cycle of corruption which ends in possession and depravity, the executioner who rode the chariot would be possessed by the chariot itself, or perhaps it was the other way around. As an aside, the horse was the animal of Hugo. It dashes relentlessly and tramples over its foes. This can be observed in Benhart of Hugo's helmet, which is ornamented with a horse. His chest, however, bears the heraldic symbol of Mira, the deer, because his clan defected from Hugo. The men of Hugo are simple-minded but strong, in contrast to its women, who are cunning sorceresses. His clan was offered an ancient treasure in trade for their loyalty, and they gladly accepted the offer without realizing the sham. The sword was a fake. The Moonlight Greatsword scales with intelligence, and Benhar's fake sword is a raw imitation. but he and his clan were too simple-minded to notice, as are the men of Hugo. Egil, the suspicious pyromancer, proposed to the Iron King he should not only use his broom tower to produce copious amounts of iron, but also to create new beings from its Icarus liquid, the lava that derived from Gwyn's soul. Along with the supply of the Icarus mineral, the old and rusty golems of Heidi were melted and recycled into matter to create new golems. Among them rose the Iron Warriors, automatons that subtly mirrored Idolith's giants, whose heads were ornate iron sculptures of the crest of the king's clan, a bull. They wielded massive weapons and leaked lava from their otherwise empty frames onto their enemies. The ironclad soldiers would also come from this array of robots. In response to the king's approval of his ideas, which were based on his ambition to be like the Witch of Izalith, a creator of an army of demons who'd subjugate the world, Egil would task the metal workers with sculpting an iron statue of a minotaur as a gift to his lord. That statue, which would be known as Egil's idol, is a reference to Moloch, the Canaanite god who demanded human sacrifice in trade for material benefits, whose worshippers built metallic statues of, which doubled as furnaces that burned the sacrifice. The bull represented masculinity, strength, and abundance. It was a fitting symbol to represent the clan that idealized strong warriors and that possessed a large fortune. The ancient depiction of a lion slaying a bull represents the start of the harvest season. However, it too had been subverted into an idol of human sacrifice and futile materialism. The bull wasn't slain but idolized, like Moloch. It stood for stagnation, for eternal life in the material world, which would be sustained by the sacrifices of the meek. The Iron King would hire a band of foreign mercenaries who he had invited to his kingdom, a lot known as the Mad Warriors, as they fought like berserkers on the battlefield. Their leader was a man who wielded a twin blade, and the rings of blades were forged in the image of his weapon. They were hollowing undead whose sanity was depleted, and who wanted to fill their emptiness with killing, and by playing with their prey, they were predators of men, like the predator which their designs reference. In response to the king's moral downfall, his right-hand man, Sir Alonne, would break his vow and leave the kingdom feeling utterly disappointed with the man he had once looked up to, who he thought would become a true king, leaving only his armor behind. Or perhaps he did not, but lied within his chamber, its floor immaculately polished, a symbol of his immaculate soul, for as is above, so is below, loyally sitting in secluded wait for a worthy warrior to break into the castle and challenge him so that he might, at last, be honorably discharged from the oath sworn to his king. Or perhaps he did both of those things. Alonne parallels Aaron, the biblical character he shares a name with, the Iron King, Moses, Aaron's brother. However, instead of punishing heretics for their worship of a false idol, a golden bull which stood for hedonism, he embraced it, becoming like a Moloch himself. Upon hearing of Alonne's disappearance, along with his company of knights, the king would animate their armors as automatons, and tasked them with guarding the keep for eternity. His loyal, honored men were leaving his command, and he has to replace them with empty husks, a symbol for the decadence of both him and his empire. The Iron King's most ambitious project was the creation of an iron dragon, yet another emblematic display of his twisted character, for it represents an unholy mockery of nature. After all, the dragon is the prima materia, nature incarnate. This project also mirrors Gwyn's ambition to attain the metaphorical Philosopher's Stone. Egil would first create a magic-filled automaton, which would never leave the Broom Tower. This magic-filled Smelter demon was created to emulate the dragons, which were alchemically aligned with, originally, water. However, upon creating its fire-fueled counterpart, the Red Smelter demon, he transported it to the Iron Keep and presented it to his king. The king was enamored by it, so much so that he would be blinded by his fascination, and with a single strike, the dragon kills the king and destroyed his kingdom. In truth, Alken had been sinking into lava, an allegory for the Iron King's hedonism, for his pride, ever since the castle was reformed into the Iron Keep, and the smiting of the Smelter demon, who represents the indomitable, raw energy of nature, which is Satan himself. Thus, the demonic-looking design was simply the tipping point. He who had approached the profound mysteries of the soul had used his power over life to bring his own ruin. As the king sunk into the Icarus earth, he was possessed by the great soul of the Old One, which rested within it. by the soul of the Lord of Light, Gwyn. Gwyn's soul had been influencing the king's actions, or perhaps the king's actions that had made the soul become attracted to him. When they came into direct contact with each other, the Iron King was reborn as the incarnation of Lucifer, the fallen angel, the Lightbringer, of Satan, a monstrous being made from molten iron and stone, whose veins are filled with ichorous liquid, like the Greek gods. His strong frame was maintained, and on his head grew 2 enormous horns, which subtly referenced the bull, besides serving as emblems of the demonic. His dark armor would become possessed by a piece of his spirit, and would forever haunt the lands as a ghostly knight, who'd be known as Pursuer, a reference to the name of the king's homeland, Volgan, which means to pursue, though, in Japanese, the being's name is Cursebound, which has a double meaning of relating to the Iron King's human nature, as well as to the curse that binds his spirits to the armor. The armor would hunt journeying undead, interrupting their firelinking journeys, and claim their weapons, which it couldn't even wield, just out of the materialistic habit which the Iron King has developed. The unappeased souls of the men it killed would attach themselves to the black armor of the ghost, sentenced to forever be a part of it. The dichotomy between Ven and Alken inversely mirrored as the beginning of their existence, that of Karim and Torland. For Ven, the country of dexterous swordsmen and sorcerers, led by a wise woman, proliferated the curse, and Alken, the country of strong warrior priests, led by a strong man, wished to link the fire. The events which I will narrate now begin right before the start of the Iron King's downfall, and serve to complement his narrative. Mytha, the Queen of Hugo, would fall deeply in love with her arranged bride from the moment they met, for she was fascinated by the strength of his gleaming soul. For the Desert Magi are parasitic and attracted to power, like the Sisters of the Abyss themselves, but her feelings would not be reciprocated. In a display of her character, she'd become obsessed with her appearance, thinking that if she became even more beautiful than she already was, she'd steal her king's heart. A golden opportunity appeared before her. Lanafir, which was situated right above Shulva, where the slumbering dragon had been wounded by Jorg, would be filled with a poisonous miasma. She had heard stories about the immortality of the ancient dragons, and so she thought that by treating herself with the poison that originated from sin, she'd attain the beauty she coveted, a never-fading youthfulness, superior even to that which the life drain of the Desert Magi could provide. However, no matter how beautiful she became, the king remained distant, never impressed with her efforts, for his heart belonged to his secret lover, a woman he loved for her purity of soul, something Mytha would never attain. Because Lindelt had sent many of its pilgrims to deal with the demon of song, the undead crypt had lent a squad of grave wardens to Alken. They were stationed in Mytha's domain, and would serve as her guards. The undead of Hugo who fell to the curse were transported to the valley and made to work as slaves. The overseers of the mining operation of the Harvest Valley were cowardly men, who sat on the shoulders of aberrations born of dark, man-made rituals to avoid contact with the miasma. Mytha would become increasingly unhinged, mistreating her subjects more and more, going so far as to cutting the hands of those who didn't work hard enough in the mines and replacing them with hooks as punishment. She'd breathe life into slave puppets, the mannequins, with the miasma, and employ them as assassins, tasking them with slaying those who intruded upon her domain as to avoid interrupting her cosmetic procedures. She would become so mad as to replace the water that flows to her bathing chamber with liquid poison, which she would submerge herself in to achieve transcendental beauty, a reference to the fabled Fountain of Youth. This would turn her into a gorgon. Scales began to grow on her now greenish skin, and her legs fused into a serpent's tail. Disgusted with her ugly, monstrous body, she would decapitate anyone who dares to look at her, even her puppets, which couldn't see, for they had no eyes. Luckily for her, her personal guards, the grave wardens, conveniently had a veil over their faces. However, her face was, indeed, more beautiful than ever as a result of that last resort, and having realized that, the Mad Queen would decapitate herself and present her head to her king. Hence the king would never see her again, abhorred by her madness. Mytha was the fairest woman of all from the start. What she lacked was not looks, but character. Her name, which could also be translated as Mida, is a reference to Midas, the hedonistic emperor, and Baneful is a clever translation of her epitaph, since it has the archaic meaning of poisonous. Mytha cast sorcery, for her nature as a pyromancer was inversed by the essence of the dragon, which is water and dark. The configuration of the Earthen peak is a layered allegory. The castle is a reference to the Tower of Babel, with Mytha being the man who wishes to become like God. She is the demiurge, the dragon, the immortal serpent that feeds itself through the enslavement of man. The windmills, which sustain Mytha's eternal youth, stand for the samsara, the cycle of reincarnation that extracts man's souls to feast the demiurge, which is why the bearer of the curse must burn the central windmill to stop the poison from flowing into Mytha's room, to strip her of her fountain of youth. In the lower realm are the archons, the servants of the demiurge, demons who are microcosmic demiurges themselves, the desert sorceresses. And in an even lower realm are the lower demons, the slave masters. Working under them are enslaved undead, whose souls are set to fade into nothingness, and hallowing is a phenomenon opposite to that of attaining gnosis. In contrast to the king that had constantly rejected her, Auros, her former lover, the founder of Hugo, and its king, was always trying to reclaim her affection, something he never truly possessed, for he was merely her pawn. In an attempt to become strong like the man Mytha loved, he'd gouge on his fellow man, compensating for his lacking soul with cannibalism. He'd bloat like a pig, and nearly soften into sludge, transforming into a deformed, grotesque, serpent-looking demon which knew only to eat and desire. It's a tendency of the men of Hugo to conceptually and sometimes physically resemble Smaug, Gwyn's most loyal servant, the cannibal executioner, for they are meek, but covetous. This segment takes place after Vane fell to ruin. After Forossa's downfall, the warriors who resided on its mainland would become bandits and thieves and scatter to various lands. The Order of the Lion Knights, who had been now reduced to a clan of barbarians, would gradually hollow and have their forms twisted by the egregory which they cultivated, that is, of the lion-like god of war. They'd become grotesque chimeras, half man, half lion, a phenomenon that references the birth of the demons of chaos. Some of them would be petrified by the demiurgic soul of the Old One, of the Witch of Chaos, and in response, the rest of them would develop the superstitious belief that the basilisks, greedy, serpent-like creatures who petrify their victims to steal their souls, were behind the curse of their land. But instead of combating them, they'd capture travelers and offer them as sacrifices to the basilisks, who'd become their false idols. Among those travelers was Ornifex, a half-crow, half-woman creature who parallels them as their inversion. Her clan, the noble house of Karim, used to be Velka worshippers who, upon hollowing, had their shapes twisted by the egregory which they cultivated. And this is the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work, my Patreon is linked below,